bowling alley parking lot buzzed with life, families laughing, cars pulling in, but one vehicle stood out. A sleek black van, its windows tinted, sat ominously in the shadows. Inside, a young man watched intently, his gaze piercing through the lively crowd. Something about him felt unsettling, out of place. The bowling alley buzzed with energy, arcade machines, cheers, and crashing pins. The girl and her cousins relaxed on a couch, unaware of the shadow creeping closer. The man sat beside them, too close. A whisper broke the moment, "He's touching my leg." Unease turned to alarm as tension filled the air. The staircase to the bowling alley's bathroom felt colder than the rest of the building, a stark contrast to the bright, noisy lanes above. The girl descended slowly, each step accompanied by the dull creak of old wood. The hallway below was dimly lit, its fluorescent bulbs flickering intermittently, casting jagged shadows along the walls. She could feel the air change, heavier and still, as though she'd entered another world entirely, one far removed from the carefree laughter of her family upstairs. She had noticed him watching her earlier, his eyes sharp and focused, yet distant enough to seem like a figment of her imagination. Now, as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she instinctively turned back, her stomach twisting into knots. There he was, leaning over the railing above, his gaze fixed on her. His posture was casual, almost indifferent, but his eyes told a different story. They tracked her every move, unblinking, as though waiting for something. Her heart began to pound as her mind raced through possibilities. Should she go back upstairs? Call someone? But the thought of seeming paranoid held her back. "It's just your imagination," she told herself. She hurried down the narrow hall and pushed open the bathroom door, the creak of the hinges echoing ominously. Inside, the bathroom was cold and eerily silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every sound. Her shoe squeaked faintly against the tiles as she moved quickly to a stall. She locked the door behind her, her hands trembling slightly. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, a monotonous hum that filled the void. As she tried to calm herself, she heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the buzzing light. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unnervingly close. She held her breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside the bathroom door. Her mind screamed at her to stay quiet, but her chest tightened with panic. Was it him? Could it be someone else? Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. She waited, listening, every nerve in her body on high alert. Finally, the footsteps receded, fading into the distance. She exhaled sharply, trying to convince herself it was nothing, a random passerby, nothing more. Still, she didn't linger. She exited the stall quickly, washing her hands in a frenzy, her eyes darting toward the mirror. The reflection showed nothing unusual, just the empty stalls behind her and the pale, frightened face staring back. She stepped cautiously into the hallway, her heart pounding like a drum. The stairs seemed impossibly far away. She quickened her pace, keeping her head low, afraid to look around. Halfway up the staircase, she glanced back instinctively, and her breath caught in her throat. He was still there. Standing at the far end of the hall, partially hidden in the shadows, watching her. This time, his face wasn't obscured. His expression was blank, almost detached, yet something about his stillness made her stomach churn. She didn't wait. She sprinted up the stairs, her injured ankle screaming in protest, her mind racing with panic. She burst into the upper level, the bright lights and noise of the bowling alley hitting her like a wave of relief. Safe, for now. But the unease lingered. His image was seared into her mind, a shadow that wouldn't fade. And somewhere below, in the dimly lit hallway, he remained, silent, watching, waiting. Upstairs, the bowling alley was alive with noise, laughter, the crash of pins, the hum of arcade machines. But for her, it all felt distant, like a muffled soundtrack to the unease that had taken root inside her. She tried to shake it off, to convince herself that she was overreacting. Her ankle ached, a sharp reminder of the earlier twist, so she decided to sit out for a while. She found a couch tucked against the wall, away from the bustling lanes, and eased herself onto it. As she stretched out her leg, the adrenaline from earlier began to fade, replaced by a nagging tension. The man's face haunted her, his blank stare, the way his presence lingered just long enough to unsettle. She told herself it was all a coincidence. People loiter all the time, don't they? But then, across the room, she saw him again. He was seated at a table, his posture rigid, as though his body were there but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't eating or drinking. He had no reason to stay. But there he was, his eyes darting between her and the glow of his phone screen. It wasn't the kind of casual glance that strangers exchange in passing. It was deliberate, calculated, like he was keeping track of her movements. The couch, which had seemed like a sanctuary moments ago, now felt like a trap. She sat up straighter, glancing around the room, searching for someone she could tell, someone who might understand. Her parents were still bowling, laughing with her aunt and uncle, oblivious to the growing tension in her chest. She clenched her hands tightly, trying to ground herself. The minutes dragged on, stretching into an eternity. Each time she glanced at him, he was there, his phone in hand, the faint blue glow illuminating his face in the dimly lit corner. He would check the time, put the phone down, and then look back at her. Over and over. It was a rhythm she couldn't ignore. Why is he watching me, she thought, her mind cycling through possibilities. Did she know him from somewhere? Was he just bored? Or was it something darker? Every explanation seemed more unlikely than the last. She remembered the way he had touched her cousin earlier, the way he had loitered near the bathroom. None of it added up to something innocent. Desperate for a distraction, she pulled out her own phone and dialed her best friend on FaceTime. The familiar ring brought a momentary sense of relief. Her friend's face appeared on the screen, cheerful and unaware of the mounting dread on the other end of the call. "You're being paranoid," her friend said with a laugh, her voice light and dismissive. "He's probably just some weirdo. Don't give him the satisfaction of freaking you out," she nodded along, trying to believe it. But her eyes kept drifting back to the man. He hadn't moved. He hadn't looked away. He was still there, watching, waiting. Her friend's voice became background noise as she tried to focus on her breathing. Inhale, exhale. Count to 10. She told herself she was safe. The bowling alley was full of people. He couldn't do anything here, not in public, but then came the moment that changed everything. As she sat on the couch, trying to convince herself that this was all in her head, the man stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, as though he wanted her to notice. He slipped his phone into his pocket and began walking, his steps unhurried but purposeful. Her pulse quickened. He wasn't leaving. He was coming closer. Her muscles tensed, the instinct to run battling against her need to stay calm. She gripped her phone tightly, her friend's voice echoing faintly from the screen. The man didn't stop until he was a few feet away, his eyes locked on hers. Then, as if testing the waters, he leaned against a nearby wall, his posture casual but his intent unmistakable. The girl's thoughts raced. Should she get up? Go to her parents? But she didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to admit, even to herself, that she was afraid. Moments later, her father called out, breaking the tension like a hammer on glass. "We are heading out," he shouted from across the room. Relief washed over her as she stood up quickly, almost stumbling in her rush to leave. She stayed close to her father as they exited the building, the cool night air hitting her like a wave. But the relief was short-lived. As her family gathered outside, she glanced back toward the bowling alley. Through the glass doors, she saw him again, his figure partially obscured by shadows. He was watching them leave, his phone once again in his hand. Her father unlocked the truck, and she climbed in quickly, grateful for the barrier between herself and the man. But as she settled into her seat and rolled down the window for some fresh air, her heart sank. Across the parking lot, the man had climbed into his van. His window was down, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. She couldn't read his expression. It wasn't angry or aggressive, but it wasn't neutral either. It was something else. Something calculating. As her mother climbed into the truck and they began to pull out of the lot, she tried to shake the feeling of being watched. But as they drove onto the main road, her worst fear was confirmed. The black van pulled out behind them. Her father noticed almost immediately, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. He didn't say anything at first, but the tension in his jaw was unmistakable. It wasn't until the van followed them through 2 more turns that he spoke. "Hold on," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We are going to take a different route." The girl's heart pounded as her father began making erratic turns, navigating through side streets and doubling back in an effort to lose their follower. The van stayed close, its headlights a constant presence in the mirror. For what felt like an eternity, they drove in silence, the atmosphere inside the truck thick with fear. Finally, after what seemed like endless twists and turns, the van was gone. Her father drove home cautiously, checking the mirrors constantly. When they pulled into their driveway, the girl felt a wave of relief. But as she stepped inside the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The man had been deliberate, methodical. His actions weren't random. She didn't know what he wanted, but she knew one thing for sure: she never wanted to see him again. The night was quiet as they pulled out of the bowling alley parking lot, the hum of the truck's engine blending into the stillness. For a moment, the girl allowed herself to relax, thinking the evening's tension might finally be over. She glanced out the window, watching the darkened streets roll past, but her relief was short-lived. From the corner of her eye, she noticed it, the black van pulling out of the lot just seconds after them. Her stomach sank as she turned to look. The vehicle's headlights glared in the side mirror, trailing closely behind their truck. She told herself it was nothing, that it was just a coincidence, but the weight in her chest told her otherwise. Her father noticed too. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression tightening. Without a word, he made a sharp turn down an unfamiliar side street. The van followed. "He's tailing us," her father muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice was calm, but the urgency in his movements betrayed him. He accelerated, taking random turns, weaving through quiet residential neighborhoods in an attempt to shake the persistent vehicle. Each time they turned, the van stayed with them, its headlights a constant, menacing presence in the mirror. Inside the truck, the tension was suffocating. The girl's heart pounded as she clutched her phone, her hands trembling. Her mother turned to her father, whispering questions he couldn't answer. The girl stayed silent, her mind racing with dread. Why was this happening? What did he want? Her father's voice broke the silence again, low but firm. "Hold on. I'll lose him." The truck surged forward, its tires screeching slightly as her father made another sharp turn. The neighborhood streets blurred together, quiet houses, dim streetlights, and empty sidewalks rushing past. But the van was relentless, matching their every move. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as her father took turn after turn, leading them deeper into unfamiliar territory. He ran a red light at one point, his eyes flicking between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Still, the van followed. "Who is this guy?" her mother whispered, her voice shaking. The girl didn't answer. She couldn't. Her thoughts were consumed by the man from the bowling alley, the way he had stared, the way he had loitered near her, the calculated way he had touched her cousin. Now, his pursuit felt like a nightmare brought to life. Finally, after another desperate turn, the van's headlights disappeared. Her father slowed the truck, his eyes scanning the mirrors, searching for any sign of the vehicle. For a few agonizing moments, they waited, the truck creeping forward cautiously. The van was gone. Relief washed over them like a wave, but it was fleeting. Her father didn't stop checking the mirrors until they reached their driveway. As they parked, the girl couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see the van lurking in the shadows. But the street was empty. They hurried inside, locking the doors behind them. The girl sat on her bed later that night, staring out the window. The dark street outside seemed quiet, too quiet, as though holding its breath. Somewhere out there, she knew, the man was still out there. Waiting. Watching. And the dread she felt refused to fade. Later that night, the house was silent. The girl sat on her bed, her room bathed in the pale glow of her phone screen. She scrolled aimlessly, trying to distract herself, but her thoughts were consumed by the events of the evening. Every creak of the house made her flinch, every shadow seemed to shift, and the unease that had followed her all night refused to leave. She glanced toward the window. The blinds were shut, but the faint outlines of tree branches swayed against them, casting eerie patterns on the walls. She told herself it was nothing. Just the wind. But the memory of the van, of the man's unblinking stare, lingered. Her parents had gone to bed, trusting that the locked doors and darkened windows would keep them safe. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The way he had followed them so relentlessly, there was an intention behind it, one she didn't want to understand. Her phone vibrated, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her best friend. "See? Told you everything would be fine. Stop freaking yourself out and get some sleep." She stared at the words, wanting to believe them. But the knot in her stomach wouldn't loosen. Unable to resist, she got up and walked toward the window. Slowly, she lifted the edge of the blinds, just enough to peek outside. The street was dark, lit only by a single street lamp at the corner. For a moment, she saw nothing. No cars, no movement, just the quiet stillness of the suburban night. She exhaled, relief beginning to creep in. But then, at the very edge of the shadows, she saw it, a faint shape. A van parked further down the street, partially hidden behind a row of trees. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't see the driver, but she didn't need to. She knew it was him. The blinds snapped shut, her hands trembling. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. Should she wake her parents? Call the police? She sat on the edge of her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. Outside, the van remained silent, unmoving, watching.